They called me their biggest mistake. Right to my face on my 16th birthday, while the candles on my cake were still burning. I stood there, frozen, holding a fork, watching my own mother refill her wine glass like she hadn't just cracked my entire world in half. My father didn't even look up from his phone. That moment, that exact ugly, humiliating moment, is the one I've replayed in my mind almost every day for the last 12 years. And for 12 years, I believed them. My name is Cassidy Marlowe, and I am 31 years old. I have a good job, a small apartment with a lemon tree on the balcony, and a therapist named Dr. Reyes who told me, during our very first session, that I had been conditioned to accept emotional neglect as love. I didn't cry when she said it. I just nodded and stared at the carpet and thought, yeah, that sounds about right. I grew up in Gardenfield, Ohio, a mid-sized town where everybody knew everybody's business and nobody talked about the things that actually mattered. My parents, Lawrence and Pamela Marlowe, were what people in our neighborhood called a power couple. Dad ran a successful real estate firm. Mom chaired 3 charity committees and wore her smile like armor. From the outside, we were the picture-perfect family. Big colonial house, 2 cars in the driveway, a daughter who made straight A's and never caused a scene. But behind closed doors, I was invisible, unless I was inconvenient. Then I was the reason everything in their lives had gone wrong. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I was not a troubled kid. I did not throw tantrums or fail classes or sneak out at night. I was quiet and careful and tried, in every small way I could think of, to take up as little space as possible. I thought if I was good enough, neat enough, invisible enough, they would stop looking at me like I was a problem they hadn't solved yet. It never worked. No matter how small I made myself, I was still too much for them. What I didn't know then, what nobody told me until I was 31 years old, was that their resentment had nothing to do with anything I had ever done. It had everything to do with a secret they had buried long before I was even born. And the only person who ever loved me enough to tell me the truth was my grandfather, Walter Marlowe, a quiet, steady man who had been carrying that secret for 30 years and finally decided he couldn't die with it. This is that story. Growing up in the Marlowe house was like living inside a museum. Everything was beautiful, everything was arranged perfectly, and you were not allowed to touch anything. I learned early that Lawrence and Pamela had a version of life they were performing for the world, and I was a supporting character in that performance, not a daughter. Not really. When I was 7, I knocked over a vase in the living room while playing, and my mother looked at me with an expression I can only describe as genuine contempt. She didn't raise her voice. She just said very quietly, "Cassidy, you ruin things. That's what you do." Then she walked away and called the cleaning service. My father was softer in his coldness. He was simply absent. Physically present at the dinner table, emotionally somewhere on another planet. He'd pat my head when company was over, call me kiddo, and forget my teacher's name 5 seconds after I told him. The few times I tried to reach him, showing him a drawing, a report card, a story I'd written, he'd glance at it and say, "That's great, Cass," and go back to whatever he was doing. I could have handed him a blank piece of paper and gotten the same response. The only warmth I ever felt in those years came from 40 minutes down the road. Grandpa Walt's farmhouse was the opposite of everything our home was. Worn and comfortable and completely without pretense. He never asked me to be smaller or quieter or more convenient. He just let me exist. We'd spend entire Saturdays saying very little, fishing at the creek behind his property, and somehow that silence felt safer than anything inside our house ever did. My mother tolerated Grandpa Walt the way you tolerate a neighbor's barking dog. Polite to his face, dismissive the moment he left. I noticed. Children always notice these things, even when adults believe they don't. School became my other escape. Not because I loved it, but because it was somewhere I could breathe without someone measuring the air I used. I kept my grades up, stayed out of trouble, and came home each afternoon already bracing myself for whatever mood the house was holding that day. When I was 10, I was sitting in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom one night, listening to them argue. My mother's voice was sharp and clipped. She said, "She was never supposed to happen, Lawrence. You know that." My father said nothing. Just silence. The kind that means yes. I never forgot those words. I carried them for 21 years. I just didn't know yet that the story behind them was nothing like what I had assumed. I turned 16 on a Thursday in March. It had been raining all week. One of those cold, gray Ohio springs that feels like the sky is trying to tell you something. My mother had made a cake. Yellow with white frosting, my favorite since I was little. It should have felt like a kindness, but everything in our house came with invisible strings attached. We sat at the dining room table, me, Mom, and Dad, and I blew out the candles while they watched with the polite expressions of people at a work function. No singing. They had stopped singing happy birthday to me sometime around age 12. Dad poured himself a scotch. Mom poured wine. I cut the cake. I think I said something about wanting to take an art class the following semester. I had always loved drawing, filling up notebooks I kept hidden under my bed. Maybe I was feeling brave that night. Maybe I was just hoping that on my birthday, of all nights, they would respond differently. My mother set down her fork. "Cassidy," she said, in that quiet, measured voice that was somehow worse than shouting. "Your father and I had a plan for our lives, and you were not part of it." I looked at my dad. He was looking at the table. "You were the biggest mistake of our lives," she continued, smoothing the napkin in her lap. "I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I think you're old enough to understand reality." My dad said nothing. He sipped his scotch. I sat with a forkful of cake halfway to my mouth and put it back down. I didn't cry. I had learned long before that night that tears made my mother impatient and made my father uncomfortable, and neither reaction ever helped me. So I just sat there in the rain-gray silence of that dining room, with the birthday cake and the candles burned down to nothing, and I let the words land. I excused myself, went upstairs, and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling for 3 hours. Something shifted in me that night. Not loudly. There was no dramatic moment, no decision I announced to anyone. It was quieter than that, a slow, cold settling, like a door closing softly on everything I had hoped they might one day become. I stopped waiting for them after that birthday. I stopped trying to be something they would choose to love. Instead, I started thinking about leaving. Not running. I was too careful for that. Just building, quietly and deliberately, the kind of life that would one day put enough distance between me and that dining room table that their words could never find me again. I had no idea yet that those words were built on a lie. I spent the next 2 years executing the quietest rebellion of my life. I didn't act out. I didn't fail my classes. I didn't give my parents any reason to look closely at me, because I had learned that their attention was never the kind that helped. Instead, I became almost surgically focused. I got a part-time job at the public library the summer I turned 17, telling my parents it was for college application experience. They approved without much thought. It fit the image of the daughter they needed for their performance. What they didn't know was that half of every paycheck was going into a savings account at a bank across town, with Grandpa Walt as co-signer. He had offered without me asking. He always seemed to understand things I hadn't said out loud yet. "You're building your runway," he told me once, sitting on his porch while the sun went down over his back field. Smart girl. Those 3 words meant more to me than anything said inside our house in years. I applied to 7 colleges and got into 4. I chose Beaumont University in Nashville. Far enough from Gardenfield that a surprise visit was unlikely, far enough from everything that house represented. I told my parents with as little ceremony as possible. My mother said Nashville was a fine city for certain kinds of people. My father said he hoped I had chosen something practical. I had chosen graphic design, as close to art as I could get while still being employable. Neither of them asked why I chose it. I left on a Saturday in August. My father shook my hand. My mother kissed my cheek and said, "Try not to embarrass us, Cassidy." I loaded my bags into a used Honda I had saved $4,200 to buy, pulled out of the driveway, and did not look in the rearview mirror once. College was the first place I ever felt like a full person. Professors who took my work seriously. Friends who asked what I thought and actually waited for the answer. I carried the damage from home with me. That kind of thing doesn't just disappear because you change your zip code. But for the first time I had enough room around me to start understanding it. I graduated with honors, took a job at a design agency in Nashville, and built a life that was small and honest and entirely mine. My parents and I kept what I would call a surface relationship after that. Holiday calls. A visit every year or 2 that lasted exactly 2 days and felt like holding your breath the entire time. When I succeeded, they were proud, not of me, but of how I reflected on them. I had long since made peace with that difference. Then 2 years ago, Grandpa Walt called. I remember exactly where I was when he called. Sunday morning, kitchen table, coffee going cold beside me, sketchbook open in front of me the way it always was on weekends. His name came up on my phone, and I answered with a smile already on my face. But his voice stopped me. Grandpa Walt had always sounded like solid ground, deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that made you feel like whatever was happening could be handled. That morning his voice was still his, but there was something sitting underneath it. A weight I had never heard there before. The kind that comes from carrying something a very long time. "Cassidy," he said, "I need to tell you something. I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. Can you do that for me?" I closed my sketchbook. "Yes, Grandpa. I can do that." He told me first that he had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease 6 months earlier. He was 81 and said he had made his peace with time. But there was something he had been holding for 31 years that he refused to take with him. Dying with it, he said, would be a cowardice he couldn't afford. Then he told me I was not an accident. My mother had struggled to get pregnant for years after she and my father married. The fertility treatments were expensive and exhausting and put a pressure on their marriage that neither of them handled well. When she finally conceived, when she conceived me, she believed it would be the thing that saved them. It didn't save anything, because what was broken between them had nothing to do with having a child. My father had been having an affair. It had started before I was born and continued after. My mother found out when I was around 3 years old. She didn't leave. She stayed, for the image, for the life they had built together, for the version of herself she had invested too much in to walk away from. But she never forgave him. And slowly, without perhaps even fully realizing it, she began redirecting that pain onto me. I was the symbol of everything she had given up and never gotten back. I was the easiest target in the house. She told herself you were the mistake, Grandpa Walt said. But you were never the mistake, sweetheart. You were the only real thing that came out of that marriage. Then his voice broke, just slightly, and he apologized. For staying quiet so long. For believing it wasn't his place to step in. For every year he had watched what was happening and told himself it would work itself out. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to my own breathing and did not say a single word. I didn't call my parents that day, or the next day, or the week after. I needed time to sit with what I had just learned before I did anything with it. I went back to Dr. Reyes and sat in her small, calm office and laid the whole thing out. Every word Grandpa Walt had said, every piece of it. When I finished, I looked at her and said, "So everything they told me about being a mistake, it was never about me. It was their mess. They just aimed it at me." She nodded. "That's a very accurate way to put it. For 31 years I've been carrying something that was never mine," I said. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't." I went home and gave myself permission to fall apart a little. Not in a destructive way. Just in the honest way that happens when something you've believed about yourself for your entire life turns out to be false. I cried. I got angry. I took long walks and filled up notebooks and let myself feel the weight of the childhood I should have had. And then, slowly, something unexpected started coming through underneath all of it. It felt like freedom. Because when you find out the story was never true, you also find out that everything you did to manage around it, all the careful behavior, the shrinking, the 2-day visits where you held your breath the entire time, the phone calls where you tiptoed around their moods, none of it was ever yours to do. You were never the problem. You were just the closest available place to put one. I felt a flash of anger at Grandpa Walt too, briefly, for waiting so long. But it passed quickly because I understood it. He was from a generation that believed family problems stayed inside the family. He had watched things unfold slowly over decades, telling himself it wasn't his place. By the time he fully understood what it had done to me, I was already grown. And when it mattered most, he told me the truth. That was not a small thing. That was everything. I was not interested in a dramatic confrontation. I didn't want to make a scene or blow up their carefully maintained life in front of the neighbors they had spent 30 years performing for. That kind of revenge would have been quick and hollow and would have cost me more than it cost them. What I wanted was something quieter and more permanent. I wanted the truth out in the open, said plainly, clearly, without anger, in the very house where the lie had been told. I wanted them to have to sit across from me and hear it. So I started making a plan. Before I did anything, I needed to know how deep it went. I am a detail person. It is why I am good at design. I see things in layers. What Grandpa Walt had told me felt like the first layer peeled back on something that had been constructed carefully over decades. So I drove back to Gardenfield for the first time in over a year. Not to see my parents, but to see him. We sat in his kitchen for 2 full days. He was 81 and his memory was sharp as ever. He walked me through specific things. Fights he had witnessed between my parents, conversations he'd had with my father over the years. A moment on Thanksgiving morning when I was about 4 years old, where he had found my mother sitting alone in her car in the driveway, crying. He had knocked on the window and asked her what was wrong. She had looked at him and said, "I made too many mistakes and I can't fix any of them." He had never forgotten it either. Then he showed me something I hadn't expected. A box on the shelf in his study, next to his books. Inside were letters, old ones handwritten, going back decades. Some were from my father, written to Grandpa Walt during the early years of the marriage. Stiff and formal on the surface. But if you read between the lines, they were the letters of a man who knew he was failing everyone around him and had no idea how to stop. Some were from my mother. In one letter, written about a year before I was born, she talked about how desperately she wanted a baby. How she prayed for it every night. How she believed that becoming a mother would heal something that had been broken between her and my father for years. She had wanted me. Before I existed, she had genuinely wanted me. And then the affair, the grief, the slow collapse of the man she thought she had married. It had turned that want into something else entirely. Something that eventually got pointed at me. It didn't make what she had done right. But it made it, finally, something I could understand. I also called my father's older sister, Aunt Renata, who lived in Phoenix and had always been a distant presence in my life. I asked her carefully if she remembered anything about my parents' early years together. There was a long pause on her end. "Cassidy," she said, "I have been waiting for someone in this family to make this call for 30 years. What she told me matched everything Grandpa Walt had said, and filled in gaps he hadn't known how to fill. I wasn't the mistake. I was the witness. And they had spent my entire childhood trying to make me doubt what I saw. I called my mother on a Tuesday morning in October. I didn't tell her what I knew. Not on the phone. I simply asked if I could come for a visit, just a few days. She said yes in that particular tone she always used when she was calculating how my visit would look to the people around her. I drove the 4 hours to Gardenfield and arrived at the Colonial House on a Wednesday afternoon. The house looked exactly the same. That was somehow the strangest part. Everything inside me had shifted completely, and the blue shutters were still the same shade of blue. We got through the first evening the usual way. My mother talked about her charity work. My father talked about a property deal. Both of them talked at me rather than to me, the way they always had. I helped clear the dinner dishes. I went to bed in my old room, which had been converted into a guest room at some point. Same bed, new neutral duvet, my old drawings gone from the walls as though they had never been there. The next morning after breakfast, I sat down at the kitchen table while my mother was refilling her coffee and said very calmly, "Mom, I need to talk to you and Dad about some things Grandpa Walt told me." She stopped pouring. "Walt," she said. "Not a question." "Dad too," I said. "Can you get him?" My father came in from his study. They both sat down and I could see them doing what they had always done, arranging their faces, preparing themselves. But I was not there to perform anything. I told them everything, calmly and clearly, without raising my voice. The affair, the fertility struggles, the way their broken marriage had been quietly aimed at me for 30 years. I brought up the birthday, the cake, the candles, the words my mother had said while my father stared at the table. I told them I had spent my whole life carrying a story about myself that turned out to never have been about me at all. My father looked at the table. My mother's face did something complicated. "Cassidy, it's not that simple," my father started. "I'm not asking you to explain," I said. "I'm not here for an apology either. I'm here because the lie needed to be said out loud in the room where it started. That's all." My mother set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking slightly. "You were wanted," she said, barely above a whisper. "In the beginning." "I know," I said. "Grandpa Walt showed me your letter." She closed her eyes. For just a moment she looked less like the woman who had called me her biggest mistake, and more like the woman who had once prayed for me to exist. It didn't fix 30 years. But for the first time in that house, something between us was finally real. After that conversation, I drove straight to Grandpa Walt's farmhouse. He was sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching his fields, the same way he always did in the morning. He looked up when I pulled in, and I could tell from his face that he had been waiting. Not just that morning, but for a long time before it. I sat down next to him, and we were quiet for a while. The easy kind of quiet that only exists between people who genuinely trust each other. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. I think I'm okay. I think I might actually be okay. He reached over and put his hand on mine, those big, calloused hands that had taught me to fish and read and believe I was worth something. And he said, "You always were, Cass. From the very first time I held you." I cried then. Not the careful, controlled kind I had taught myself in that house. The kind where you make sure nobody notices. This was different. It came from somewhere deep and long compressed. The kind of crying that happens when you finally put down something you have been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it was. He didn't try to stop it or fix it. He just sat with me, the way he had always sat with me, and let it be what it was. When I pulled myself together, I told him everything about the conversation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at his fields. "Your father has spent his whole life running," he said finally. "From himself, mostly. I failed him in some ways, too. I wasn't soft enough with him when he was young. He never learned how to sit with hard things." He paused. "That doesn't excuse what he did to you." "I know," I said. "And your mother made herself smaller to fit inside a life that wasn't working," he said. "And then she needed someone even smaller to look down at. That person should never have been you." We sat together until mid-afternoon. He made soup for lunch. In the afternoon, I helped him pull up the last of the autumn tomatoes from the garden, the same way I had done when I was 8 years old, and the familiarity of it, the cold soil, the smell of the plants, his quiet presence beside me, felt like something being gently restored. The reckoning I had imagined was supposed to feel bigger than this. More dramatic, more symmetrical. But what I found instead was something quieter and more lasting. I had walked into that house, said the true thing out loud, and walked back out still standing. That turned out to be exactly enough. It has been 8 months since I sat at that kitchen table and told my parents what I knew. My relationship with them is different now. Not repaired, not warm, but honest in a way it never was before, and that is not nothing. My mother called about 3 weeks after my visit and left a voicemail I have listened to more times than I will admit. She didn't apologize exactly. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said. I think about it every day." And then she said, "You didn't deserve it, Cassidy. None of it." And then she hung up. It is not enough. But it is more than I ever had from her in 31 years. My father has been quieter and more awkward around me, which for him means he is actually sitting with something real. He asked me to have lunch with him when I passed through Garden Field in January. Just the two of us. We sat in a diner and he stared at his coffee for a long time and finally said, "I wasn't the father you deserved." I said, "No, you weren't." We finished our sandwiches. It was uncomfortable and honest and strangely okay. Grandpa Walt is doing well. His heart is stable with medication, and he is as sharp and warm as he has ever been. I visit him every 2 months now, sometimes more. Last spring we planted a new section of his garden together, sunflowers, late tomatoes, and a row of lavender he had been wanting to add for years. At one point, while we were on our knees in the dirt, he looked over at me and said he was proud of me. Not for anything specific, just for the person I had become. I had to look away for a moment before I could answer him. I am still in Nashville. Still at the agency, though I am an art director now, which feels like a very particular kind of proof that the girl with the hidden sketchbooks turned out just fine. The lemon tree is still on my balcony. I still see Dr. Reyes, more for maintenance now than recovery. If you have ever been told you were someone's mistake, I want you to hear this clearly. That story belonged to the person who told it. It was never yours. The pain was real, but the meaning they tried to attach to your existence was theirs, built from their own wreckage, and they were wrong to hand it to you. Grandpa Walt said something to me recently that I keep turning over in my mind. He said, "The truth has a timing. It waits until you're ready, and then it finds you." It found me at 31. And when it didn't destroy me. It freed me. And that was the only revenge that ever really mattered.